Thank you, everyone, for joining me for these live internet studies week after week. My name is Ariel Ben Lyman Hanavi. The live internet studies is an hour and a half long. Thank you for joining me for the first part. This is segment one. It's an hour long. It's entitled Eschatology, a biblical study of end time events, talking about all things end time prophecy, Book of Daniel, Antichrist, Olivet, Discourse, Rapture, Mystery Babylon, Book of Revelation. All those things are on the table. Tonight we're going to be working again through Rapture views, a final analysis. We're just working our way through topic number 12. The second segment is 30 minutes long, and we tackle Trinitarian verses. Well, they're not really Trinitarian by themselves, but they are verses that are open for discussion between a Trinitarian like myself and biblical Unitarian, which is taking the non-Trinitarian position. It's kind of like a mock debate. And tonight we start on our final verse out of the Tanakh, out of the Old Testament, which is in the book of Zechariah. So stick around if you are interested in Trinity topics. Okay, without further ado, let's jump into the first topic. Topic 12, first segment. Topic 12, Rapture views, a final analysis. What I've been doing is I borrowed these notes from gotquestions.org, which is available at their website at gotquestions.org. And they had this short essay series, 4 different ones, where they asked the question, what are the strengths and weaknesses of any given different rapture position? And we've been working from the one that they have entitled, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the Prewrath view of the rapture? Now, let me show you real quick the 4 rapture views that I myself am working from, that Got Questions created their own questions from as well. So these are the 4 basic, these are all historic premillennial, which means we all believe in a millennial kingdom that will be ushered in, a literal millennial kingdom, but there will be a rapture prior to the millennial kingdom. When will this rapture happen? Well, in the upper right corner, I keep saying right, and I mean left. Let's try that again. I said this last time too. Upper left-hand corner, we have a Prewrath rapture. The rapture itself takes place right at the very beginning of the week. Let me just blow it up for you can see, so it'll be easier. The rapture itself takes place at the beginning of what's called a 7-year tribulation. I don't believe that this name 7-year tribulation is biblical, but they refer to it by that name. And their rapture takes place right at the very beginning of it. In comparison, they have something called a second coming that takes place at the very end of that 7 years. Notable in their position is a tribulation that occupies the first 3.5 years of their 7-year tribulation, and a great tribulation that occupies the last 3.5 years of their great year tribulation. Okay, so essentially, pre-tribulation rapturists believe the church will be raptured before this final 7-year period known as Daniel's 70th week. Okay, moving along, in the upper right-hand corner, get my directions right this time, we have a view that's called the mid-tribulational rapture. And this particular view has the same 7-year time frame. I believe from all of my research that mid-tribbers follow the same dispensational theology as pre-tribbers. The mid-tribbers and pre-tribbers are the same, but if I remember right, the gentleman who I think his name is Robert Gundry. I keep getting him confused with someone else, but I think he set out to simply modify the pre-trib model as far as sequencing, but keep all of the same theology because he was a dispensationalist. So he's got the same 7-year time frame. He's got his tribulation happening at the beginning, on the beginning 3.5 year mark. He's got his rapture at the midpoint there, his second coming at the far end of the 7 years, and then his great tribulation takes place in the same place that the pre-tribbers place theirs. And you can tell it's the same dispensational theology as the pre-tribbers because they need to have their rapture prior to any great tribulation. So the big difference is he allows Christians to go into some form of tribulation, but it's definitely not the Great Tribulation. The church is absent from the Great Tribulation in that regard. So yeah, you can see similar dispensationalism, making a break from them in regards that he's allowing the church to go into the time frame that normally a dispensationalist would associate with Israel. The lower left-hand corner as the view known as, let's try that one again, has the view that's called post-tribulation rapture. And they take the 7 years, and according to many models that I've been researching, it's still called the 7-year tribulation, which means it's synonymous with the wrath of God. The tribulation and the wrath are kind of these conflated terms in all three of these models. They don't seem to make a need to distinguish between what is God's tribulation and the tribulation that men experience on planet Earth, even if it's stuff that includes Antichrist activity. But nevertheless, they've got their first 3.5 years marked out by tribulation. They've got their last 3.5 years marked out by great tribulation. Where's their rapture? Well, it's right on the very end with their second coming. So they simply combine those two. There are some advantages to combining those two, but I think the one big disadvantage is that it flattens out the sequencing in the book of Revelation much too simply to just combine them all into one single event there. But we'll talk about that in time. And then the final view in the lower right-hand corner, the view that I love, is the pre-wrath rapture. And the pre-wrath rapture is new in name, but it is not new in theology. Nope. According to what we can tell, it's been around since the early church days, since what, in other words, is what the New Testament teaches. So there's this 7-year time frame, but suddenly we lose the identifying marker 7-year tribulation. We simply call it by what we believe the Bible is more biblically accurate, which is the 70th week of Daniel. It's got 3.5 years. Let me try that one again. It's got 3.5 years of beginning of sorrows. Wow, what happened to tribulation? Yeah, because that's not biblical to call the first 3.5 years tribulation. It's got a second, not 3.5 years, but a great tribulation that takes place during the second half. But it's not called, the entire time frame is not called the Great Tribulation. Instead, there's a pre-wrath rapture, which it is seen as a kind of an initiation of the second coming, which is also an initiation of what's called the day of the Lord, or God's wrath, or something to that effect. So all of that, all of those details are taken from what we believe are more biblically accurate labels so to help you identify what sequencing takes place when. When will the rapture take place? Pretrib rapturists believe the rapture will occur following the opening of the sixth seal of the book of Revelation. That sixth seal itself takes place sometime after the midpoint, after the Great Tribulation is cut short, and then the church will experience severe persecution by the Antichrist, but will be snatched away before God begins to pour out his wrath during the day of the Lord. So those are the four views that are open for discussion tonight. Of course, we're only going to be focusing on, when we go back over to Got Questions essay, notice they asked the question, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the pre-wrath view of the rapture? And in their essay, we've already done this, I'm not going to go through this again, but I'm just scrolling down to show you what I'm going to be doing tonight. In their essay, they critique the pre-wrath view. It's helpful to know that this GotQuestions.org ministry is owned and operated by Pretrib theology, by those who adhere to a pre-trib rapture theology. So in their critique of pre-wrath, when they got down into moving past what they say might be strengths, they highlighted one weakness of the pre-wrath rapture position is its presumption that the elect mentioned in Matthew 24, 22, and 31 are church-age saints. And so we've been parked out on refuting this label that our identification of the elect is labeled as weak, right? They say that this is one weakness. They've got another one down here below, what they call another flaw, but we're not going to deal with that tonight. We'll deal with that in time. So let's turn to this short essay that I wrote called Prewrath Weakness is number one. the elect of the Olivet Discourse is the church. And I put this little asterisk because I myself even mistakenly characterized what this label is supposed to mean. I put this little asterisk that says, "So says many pre-tribulational rapturists," so that you don't misunderstand. In other words, it's the pre-tribbers who think that when we pre-wrathers label the elect as the church, the pre-tribbers think that that's a weakness of our position. So in order for you to understand where I'm about to go, you have to know that the pre-tribbers believe that the Olivet Discourses found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not represent the church. Remember, in their model, the church must be raptured prior to their so-called 7-year tribulation. And there are a number of reasons why they believe they should be, that the church needs to be raptured. Okay, so what we did is we embarked on this last week, and we took I keep saying last week. We embarked on it 2 weeks. We took a break for the Pentecost/Shavuot celebration. That was, depending on what calendar you follow, whether it was last week or just yesterday or it's going on now. But the study that we're looking at is largely critiquing or refuting what pre-trib thinks are weaknesses of the pre-wrath position. And I tell you what, I opened up a can of worms on this one. I brought out all of the pre-tribbers coming after me. Normally, I like to push back the hardest on post-trib because they're the ones that are so close to my position, and I'm trying to gently nudge them over into the light. Just one more step. They've already taken a step away from pre-trib, and they never really even entertained mid-trib. So many former pre-tribbers are actually current post-tribbers. I'm trying to push them one step further into pre-wrath. Of course, this is an in-house debate, right? It doesn't really matter salvifically which position you take. If you're a believer, it doesn't matter which position you take. God's going to send his son for those who truly follow him, not for those who hold to a particular eschatological rapture position, right? But if you're an unbeliever, it matters. It's crucial that you embrace a position that teaches that Jesus is coming back. I mean, there are a lot of positions out there that kind of wash all that out, spiritualize a lot of the details, and get so many parts wrong that, or are so weak that one wonders if they're even biblical at all. So if you're a believer, it shouldn't really matter per se, but if you're an unbeliever, then if you don't get eschatology right, then you might not meet Messiah. It's that critical, right? So back to what we're looking at tonight. I've been pushing hard on the pre-tribbers, and this brought out their ire. I've got all these comments that I've been dealing with during the break. And so, you know what? This week, I'm coming out swinging myself. All right, but this is all in Christian love. But seriously, I'm gonna press hard again back on some of the issues that they pushed towards me. So moving past point number 1, we hit this one already. Point number 1 was elect in the New Testament, the expanded people of God. And in case you didn't catch the teaching number 302, right? You can go back and watch it on my YouTube channel. It is available there. But in case you don't, point number 2 doesn't start until I actually do a summary. Originally, it was point number 2, but I turned it into a summary because I figured we would need it coming out of a long break. So I turned point number 2 into a summary of point number 1, and then point number 3 originally got relabeled as point number 2. So the entire thing lost 1 point. So let's go now into summary of point number 1. So in case you weren't here for the previous teaching, you'll now get essentially what I was working from anyway. Elect in the New Testament, the unified people of God. So my turn to come out swinging once more and push back hard on this idea that the elect in Matthew 24 and Mark 13 and Luke 21, which are the Olivet Discourse passages, that the elect in those passages is the church. I say it is the church. What am I pushing back on? I'm pushing back on the pre-trib notion that it is someone else Who do they say it is? Well, let's find out. All right, let me just read. Here's what I wrote. In the New Testament, remember, this is a summary of point 1, so this is a repeat, but in summary mode. In the New Testament, the term elect refers to all believers in Jesus, both Jews and Gentiles. Let me stop right here real quick. I've read it somewhere, I don't remember where, because I read a lot of eschatology books and blogs and watch a lot of videos and try to inform myself on all the different positions. And you should too, especially if you're in a position where, like me, where you need to teach about this stuff. But I read somewhere that your ecclesiology, which is your understanding of who the body of Messiah is, drives your eschatology, which is the study of end times. So in other words, where you land in terms of end time sequencing and theology is largely driven by your understanding of who the people of God are. And nowhere else is this more true. This is why this section is generating a lot of heated feedback in my YouTube comments and the direct emails that I'm getting from people who are watching this video and listening to this podcast, especially from the Pretribbers, because they are one of the longer established positions out there, and they hold to a position that sharply divides the people of God between the church and Israel. The other positions begin to allow for more overlap between the church and Israel. Even the mid-tribbers do, even though they're still dispensationalists. They start to allow the church to be inside of a time frame that was originally exclusively for Israel, namely the so-called 7-year tribulation period. Post-tribulation definitely allows for the overlap. In fact, they go full-blown overlap by putting the church's salvation moment combined with the Israel's salvation moment, a weakness, I think, that cannot be demonstrated from the text. But that's their position. And then we pre-wrathers come along and we still pull them apart a little bit. But we do overlap them as one, the church's salvation period being the initiation part of the day of the Lord, and Israel's salvation event, being the culmination of the day of the Lord. So they form bookends, but they're still struck together under the same one single parousia, which is the day of the Lord. So we're talking about this identity of who are the elect in the New Testament, or the elect in the Olivet Discourses. And it occurred to me that part of the confusion that I'm getting in the pushback, and I'm getting a lot of pushback from the pre-tribbers, which I find healthy. It means you're thinking about what I'm saying. But part of the pushback is caused by the nomenclature that's used in the Bible to refer to God's people. This is a side note somewhat. I'm not going to go off in this direction, but I could if I wanted to. I did a KJV search. Let me get this page to load. It doesn't want to load for me right now. Come on. There we go. Give me a second. I need all 3 of these loaded. Let's see if this one's going to load or if it's going to take its time. Come on, guys. Work with me. All right, there we go. All 3 of them loaded. Okay. If I wanted to, we could go off in a completely different study where we talk about terminology. What does God call his bride? What does Jesus call his bride? Right? If we were to look up the word church in the KJV, which is the preferred version of the pre-tribbers, is why I use the KJV for this exercise, then we would find that it occurs quite a number of times from the Greek version of the word church, right? So obviously you might not find this in an English version of a KJV going back into the Old Testament, because they don't believe that the original word ecclesia has anything to do so much with Israel. But this is interesting that the pre-tribbers do like to slam the Olivet Discourse, throw it under the bus, and say that there is no elect or church in the Olivet Discourse. And when they get to Matthew's rendering of the Olivet Discourse, you ready for this? The pre-tribbers tell me that the book of Matthew was written for the Jews. Now you can hear the little bit of sarcasm in my voice. They say it was written for the Jews, and that the church is not absent in the book of Matthew, and they're certainly not present in the rest of the Gospels, really, because this is all the time period when Jesus was talking to Jewish people. The church wasn't born until Acts, is what everyone tells me, in dispensational land. But look at this. If I just take the word church, this is kind of interesting. If I even take the English word church and look it up in the New Testament, do you see on my screen right now? The book of Matthew is the only one of the Gospels of the 4 that even contains the word church. Hello? Yeah, far from telling me that the church isn't contained, that the book of Matthew isn't written to the church. Funny thing, it's the only one of the 4 that even contains the English word church, right? Wow, amazing. Using the KJV, the version that they prefer the most. You can see it on your screen now. I didn't make that up. And then we see it all over the book of Acts and things like that. And then famously, when you scroll all the way down past Paul's epistles, and you jump over towards the book of Revelation. Let me scroll down and I'm showing it to you. You get down to there, to Revelation, and famously the pre-tribbers will tell you, well, here's another proof that the church is not in the 7-year tribulation. Their label, 7-year tribulation. When you get to the book of Revelation, you find it all over the Jesus speaking to the 7 churches, right, in the first 3 chapters. That's why you find it predominantly the word church here. But then notice that the word church drops off after Revelation chapter 3. From that point in time, it doesn't show up anymore. No more church. And this gives the pre-tribbers the idea that, see, here's proof that the church is not in the 7-year tribulation because they don't show up after the rapture of Revelation chapter 4, where John is called up to heaven by a voice that sounds like a trumpet. And that to them is their rapture. And the proof is right here that Revelation chapter 3:14 is the last use of the word church. No more church word found after Revelation chapter 3. Thus, this fits with their idea that rapture takes place in Revelation chapter 4. So, interesting term. But, you know, God's smarter than terminology, right? This is not a word game. God is smarter than that. What does he do? When he wants to talk about his bride, his son's bride, he uses more than just one word, folks. Let's look at the word elect. Again, this is kind of a side note, but it goes right into my study. This is the word we're looking at now, elect. Using KJV, once again, the favorite translation of the pre-tribbers, right? The elect shows up 17 times. Well, this time it actually pulls in Old Testament passages to show us definitively that God's people, who would later be recognized as his son's bride, right, goes all the way back to the time period of the Tanakh, all the way back into Isaiah. You can see the first use of the word elect there, which is something using either the Hebrew word hagioi, or the Greek word eklektos, or one of those two. Remember, the Old Testament shows up in 2 major languages by Yeshua's day. Aramaic in smaller parts here and there, like Book of Daniel, but in major form, Hebrew and Greek. So going all the way back into Isaiah, we've got this elect, and then suddenly we jump to Matthew now again, right? Because elect. And then we could work our way down, and this time we've got Matthew and Mark and Luke, and I find it interesting that in the passages where it first shows up in the Apostolic Scriptures, Matthew's Olivet Discourse is the first place that elect shows up in the New Testament. And then the next place, again, is in Matthew. And then the next place is in Mark. But where in Mark? Mark's Olivet Discourse. Wow, imagine that. And again in Mark's Olivet Discourse. And then lastly in Luke, and it's not in the Olivet Discourse passages, but it does have a kind of a context of God, of Jesus talking about his Father bearing with the suffering of the elect, and how when will his Father avenge his own elect, a context that could be talking about Day of the Lord activities. But nevertheless, from there we move into Paul's letters and such. But notice we dead end in John with 2 John, and we don't go into the book of Revelation at this point in time. Not even the first few chapters like we saw with church. And then lastly, again, just to show that God isn't to be fooled when it comes to identifying who his people are in his word by getting tripped up on only picking one word, he introduces another word for us. And this one's called saints. And when we do this one using the same version of the Bible, KJV, we got quite a few matches. By the way, in all 3 of these, let me just reference this part. With church, we had 77 occurrences. If I switch this over to the version that I prefer, which is NASB, this number drops down dramatically. So it shows up more in the versions that the pre-tribbers prefer. In the word elect, it's 17 times. I think there it was identical in both versions. And then now here, saints shows up 96 times in the KJV. And I think, again, a fraction of these times, at least only half, I think, if I use my NASB version. But picking on saints in the KJV, again, we go all the way back into the Tanakh, the Old Testament, and we start finding verses where the saints, in one verse, the very first one in Deuteronomy, it could be referring to angels, because it talks about the Lord came from Sinai and rose up from Seir unto them. He shined from Mount Paran, and he came with 10,000 of saints. From his right hand went a fiery law for them. Most likely this is angels, not saints as in God's people. But only there, right? This is a poetic passage anyway. But only there is it kind of more focused on angels. After that, every other verse after that, as far as I can tell, except for the poetic ones, I think there might be another one in the book of Psalms. But after that, everyone is talking about God's people. And who are God's people? They're referred to as saints, those who have this relationship with God that God knows. That's why God calls them his saints. And we work our way down through the Tanakh in all of these passages, quite a number of them in the book of Psalms. Like I mentioned, you can see me scrolling by them on your screen right now. Then suddenly when we get to the book of Daniel, we've got these saints that are going to possess the kingdom. They're going to possess the kingdom forever and ever. These saints are the ones that are going to make war with the little horn, and he's going to prevail against them. We're going to see this repeated and picked up again in the book of Revelation as well. The Ancient of Days came and judgment is given to the saints of the Most High. They possess the kingdom. This is all over Daniel. And then it keeps going down into where we start jumping into Matthew now. And again, we see this seamless transition from the saints of the Tanakh period into the saints of the New Testament, the saints of the Apostolic Scriptures. We have one reference in Matthew, but then suddenly we jump into the book of Acts. Quite a number there, right? That's where the church is already born by this point in time. Paul's letters begin to pick up this idea of saints, and we can then clearly and unmistakably identify them as Christians at this point in time. We don't have to make some imaginary supposition that they're Old Testament saints. At this point in time, they are now full-blown, recognized New Testament saints because of the language that's being described to them by Paul. And then from this point in time, we can keep moving our way down into the Apostolic Scriptures, the New Testament. And notice now, again, heavy use in Paul's letters. I mean, this seems to be the preferred term that he uses instead of either church or the other term that I'm looking for, the elect. But he gets all the way down and finishes out his letters. And then when we get to the book of Revelation, we find a number of references in the book of Revelation to saints again. Revelation 1, Revelation 5, Revelation 8, Revelation 8, Revelation 11, Revelation 13, Revelation 14, Revelation 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and then finally culminating in chapter 20. And so my point is, if you're going to study the Bible and try to figure out who God's people are, don't get stuck on terminology. God has a way of describing who his people are using more than one term. You've got to look at the context, and you've got to let context drive the definition of the meaning of the words that you're looking up. It's obvious from the context that all three of these terms are God's people: the elect, the saints, and the the church. Okay, so the church, the elect, and the saints, all of these are God's people. And when we look at that, we can only draw one conclusion. And what is that conclusion? Let's go back to my study. The elect are the unified people of God. So now let me read my summary. You guys ready? That was a long little side rabbit to chase, but I think it was necessary. In the New Testament, the term elect refers to all believers in Jesus, both Jews and Gentiles. And this reflects a broadening of the concept from ethnic Israel in the Old Testament to a unified spiritual family in Messiah that we see reflected in the pages of our New Testament Bibles. Importantly, this is not replacement theology, but grafting Gentile believers into Israel's covenant promises as described in Romans 11 and Ephesians 2 and 3. chapters 2 and chapter 3. Paul is the apostle sent to the Gentiles. I think he knows who God's people are better than anyone else, and he's more qualified than anyone else to bring this gospel of the kingdom, which is the same gospel that Yeshua preached, the gospel of the kingdom, the gospel, the good news of salvation. It's one and the same gospel. There's only one gospel. I got a lot of pushback on this one too. Oh, Jesus taught the gospel of the kingdom to the Jews, and Paul taught the gospel of salvation to the Gentiles. Really? Two gospels? Are you really prepared to go in that direction? Come on, people. We're better than that. Paul taught most assuredly that the elect in the Old Testament is the same elect in the New Testament. That the saints in the Old Testament are the same saints in the New Testament. This is the church. And why is he more qualified to bring this message? Because he himself is an ethnic Jew. So I think he knows his Old Testament, and then he's bringing this Christian understanding of Judaism to the Gentiles, but contextualizing it so that they can understand how they belong to this existing people group of God. He's not replacing the Jews with a new people, and he's not allowing them to be two separate peoples like some FFOZ calls it bilateral ecclesiology, where we have two separate people groups. We neither have one group replacing the other people, nor do we have two simultaneous separate groups of people, as if God has his own bride and Jesus has his own bride, and there's really two husbands, two grooms, and two brides somehow going on. Doesn't work like that either. So let's keep going. Let me read through this. So we got some examples of what this looks like in our Bibles, especially the New Testament. We got Romans 8, Colossians 3, and Titus 1. They all show that the elect refers to the entire body of Messiah, regardless of ethnicity. This really pushes back on the dispensational idea that there are two people groups of God, that one was existing in time earlier, and then God comes along and brings in a second group. And then after he's done dealing with that second group, he returns to dealing with the first group. That's dispensational theology, which also smacks of replacement theology when the second group replaces and overtakes, or supersessionism, either one, overtakes the first group. Okay,